Okay. Hi, welcome. I know it's a bit of a long weekend. Not many of you are on campus, so I thought I would just do a video for everyone. Um, so, the primary themes in this period from 1788 to 1800, what did the Constitution mean? It's a fairly vague document, so there was a debate over that. What did the Revolution mean? This will have an interesting spin on how things are created and interpreted. And what should the government do, and where should the government's power be located? A lot of this debate over the meaning of the Constitution, in many ways, was the debate over Hamilton's planned Bank of the United States. And the question that comes down between Hamilton and Jefferson is, does the Constitution allow what it does not forbid? Does the Constitution forbid what it does not explicitly give as powers? That first one is loose construction. The second one is strict construction. Are things that are not mentioned in the Constitution but fall under necessary and proper in the elastic clause, does that allow you to do it? This debate over what the government should be allowed to do continues to inform politics to today. The debate over the meaning of the Revolution fed into this as well. You have the nationalists or federalists. They believe that the Revolution was about creating an independent America. It wasn't that the British were bad, they just couldn't rule America. America was independent. It was a war of independence. The Republicans or Jeffersonians saw the American Revolution as more of a universal event. So when the French Revolution happened, to the Republicans, this was the next logical step in a worldwide revolution of human rights and liberties. For people like Washington, the excesses of the French Revolution were horrible. It was an example of anarchy and revolutionary sentiment gone wrong. A lot of this, though, tied up in, is this basic breakdown. Things like the bank, the relationship with Britain and France during the French Revolutionary period. And then this question of whether government should be focused at the local level or the national level. You may recall, probably not, the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, which were about the Alien and Sedition Acts, which eventually lead to the nullification crisis in the Jackson administration, were in many ways a question of really who could be in charge of things, the states or the national government. And even though Jackson considered himself the heir of Jefferson, he wasn't about to let local governments push him around, hence the nullification crisis. Now, 1800 to 1848 is obviously a long period. There's a lot that happens. There's some direction, like the lead up to the War of 1812 is some direction, but there's a lot of really broad trends that can be somewhat hard to organize. And I think hopefully you'll see that they're all linked. The first is this general expansion of democracy. The original American Republic was very limited in who could vote. The rise of nationalism, the sense of national greatness, the market and transportation revolutions, the evolution of slavery, and the Second Great Awakening, the Age of Reform. So this general expansion of democracy, Jefferson believed that any educated freeholder, a person who owned their own land, who was not working for someone else, who was independent, not dependent on another person, should be able to vote, but they must be educated. This belief was not universally held when he held it. After the War of 1812, and as westward expansion occurred, there were a lot more people who owned their own land. And as they began this movement, it became almost like an appeal. You could leave New England. A state like Connecticut, for instance, had very poor ability of people to vote. You had to own a really substantial amount of property. Or you could move out to the west, Ohio or what have you, and be able to vote, own a large farm. So a lot of these begin to change after the War of 1812, after the ending of Tecumseh's sort of rebellion, after the Louisiana Purchase. You could move west, you could get new land. And Andrew Jackson became as much a symbol as a driver of this. He was a guy who moved out west to Tennessee, got rich, saw himself as a symbol of what was called the democracy. By the time of his death, you have two parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, that are both mobilizing mass numbers of voters, patronage, cultural appeals. For instance, if you were a white Southerner or an Irish immigrant, you were probably a Democrat. unless you were a white Southerner with a certain amount of national sentiment and perhaps a desire for greater wealth, in which case you were a Whig. Now, this rise of nationalism and westward expansion, Jefferson's idea of an empire of liberty, the basic idea of this was cheap, abundant land. You could be free. That's why he did the Louisiana Purchase. It also made Indian removal a necessity. Jefferson did not have a great deal of respect for Native Americans, marginally more than he had for the enslaved. And so getting rid of them became a national priority. And it was part of the reason why the War of 1812 was fought. Subsequently, during this time period, you have the Trail of Tears and the policy of Indian removal. America didn't win the War of 1812, but they decided that they did. And this became this huge upsurge of nationalism, national unity. It gets pushed a little bit in 1820 with the Missouri crisis that led to the Missouri Compromise. But for the most part, there's an effort to really bind the country together as a national project. And this was mirrored in the economics of the market and transportation revolutions. Canal building was huge. Eventually, you're going to move to railroads. They begin to come in at this time period. And this leads to this economic specialization. Southern cottons, Western farms, Northern mills. So most Americans are farmers. And they remain farmers. The majority of Americans are farmers until the late part of the 19th century. I don't want to give you the sense that suddenly there was cotton mills and everybody was working in factories. That's not true. Nor were they working in cities for that matter. So, but it's the beginning, and it's the beginning of industrialization. And it mostly happens around mills, but it also happens around the idea of economic specialization, the beginnings of what we call economies of scale, where you begin to produce a lot of something. And that also leads to the comparative advantage. New England didn't have great farming soil. Young women often were the first to go work in the mills. You could also, immigrants tended to get off the boat in the Northeast. So you could use that cheap labor in the mills. The abundant land in what's now the Midwest could be used to farm and create food for the mill workers and the enslaved who were producing the cotton for the mills. And they were all bound together by riverboats now turned rivers into two-way streets and so forth. And this obviously is linked to the evolution of slavery. There was a sense in the revolutionary generation that slavery was obviously not all men are created equal. It was a bit of an embarrassment, a bit hypocritical. They kind of assumed it would die out because the soil in the upper South was dying out. Tobacco had destroyed the viability of the soil. So it was going to die. They didn't know what they would do. There was a broad assumption that they would do what was called recolonization, which was basically forcibly evict former slaves from the country into either the Caribbean or back to Africa. They never asked them. And eventually they would create the colony of Liberia to do this. But the cotton gin changed it by making slavery profitable in the Deep South, just as the Upper South was losing the economic advantage of slavery. And this creates the Cotton Kingdom. The North sold the food, the North turned the profit on the manufactured goods, and there really wasn't a great deal of opposition to this until the Second Great Awakening comes along. The Second Great Awakening was part of this democratic movement, so we can, bring it back to this idea of the general expansion of democracy. But the idea was, it was a more democratic faith. It wasn't just listening to the preacher, it was experiencing faith. And also critical to this was this idea of millennialism. The millennium is when Jesus returns. And the idea takes hold that America needed to morally perfect itself. It needed to become the New Jerusalem. And this is something that obviously traces all the way back to, colonial America and Winthrop City on a Hill. And that you had to do it. So you had to reform the world. And the reform was explicitly religious. Temperance. People drank a lot of alcohol back then. Women's rights comes out of the Seneca Falls Convention was in 1848. Women were a major driver of the Second Great Awakening. And probably most importantly is this area, somewhat the burned over district in upstate New York, and what's sometimes referred to as Greater New England, as New England bled people into the burned over district and northern Ohio, northern Illinois, southern Michigan. it created this sense of opposition to slavery on a moral ground, not an economic ground that it wasn't profitable or even a political ground that was hypocritical, but that slavery becomes immoral. Now, the next time period, 1848 through 1877, is going to be dominated by this question of what to do about slavery. So when we look at this broad time period, we're looking at these sort of interweaving themes of what is democracy, who gets to rule, local government or state government or national government, to what degree is democracy tied to morality. It's also a little bit tied to corruption in the spoils system. So there's very often on the AP exam a question on this time period, an essay question. There's so many different things, there's so many different options to write on. Jackson, he's a complex, complicated guy. In a lot of ways, he's terrible, but he also represents the rise of this mass democracy. So you very often see an essay on Jacksonian democracy versus Henry Clay's Whiggism. You very often see questions on market revolution or westward expansion, which obviously continues all the way into the around 1900. It's a little bit tricky. It lacks the sort of sizzle, of the Revolution or the Civil War or the Progressive Era or the Great Depression. It doesn't have that nice cohesiveness. It's a little bit like the Gilded Age. A lot of stuff happens, tremendous change, very important changes, but it can be a little hard to sort of organize this material. So I hope, looking back at these general themes and understand how they tie together. The expansion of democracy is political, but it was also a product of westward expansion, which was also tied to the transportation revolution, which was in many ways tied to the need for more lands for slavery. With this transportation revolution and democratization came the Second Great Awakening. It does lack sort of tentpole events. There's the nullification crisis. There's obviously the War of 1812. You kind of have to know that. But hopefully these themes will help you organize your material in a way that'll allow you to study. So next week we'll do the Civil War period from 1848 to 1877, and then we're getting pretty close to the exam. So hopefully these sessions have helped, and this can be a resource for you.